Okay, welcome. I'm here with Lou Agosta, and we're going to be talking about his article, "Compassion Fatigue: Radical Proposal for Overcoming It." And maybe we just start by introducing ourselves. I'm Edwin Rutsch, founder of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and been working for about 12 years on the topic of empathy and how do we build a more empathic society and culture.
Right.
You want to, and this is your book, so I'm going to
Well,
do a plug for it.
Thank you, Edwin. I mean, I acknowledge you, and I acknowledge the folks who are listening to this because they're providing the empathy, they're providing the listening. I mean, the short introduction, so who the heck am I and where did this guy come from? I have been writing my one claim to fame. I'm the author of 3 academic peer-reviewed books on empathy, including A Rumor of Empathy, and most recently, a popular treatment, what I would call a attempt to reach a wider audience without a lot of technical language, although some of it does slip in once in a while, on empathy lessons. So my commitment is to expanding empathy in the individual and in the community, which is one reason why you've always been an inspiration to me, Edwin. It's been really the work you're doing. We need to cue up a picture of your empathy tent. And you've got the t-shirt on today. I decided to spruce up a bit in honor of the season. We happen to be in it's like December 17th, 2019 weekend time. So we're quickly coming up on the winter solstice here and all the holidays around that. And it's never a bad time to talk about empathy, to think about it, to engage with it. And I think it's especially appropriate at this time of year when, at least here in the States, things slow down. It becomes harder and harder to get anything done sometimes. And that's a good thing. We need to slow down and
It's a stressful time too. Like a lot of extra stuff on people's already busy schedules and cause a lot of stress and tension too.
It can be. I just want to say that Santa Claus, that guy needs so much help. I'm being a little bit silly here, but if he could just do the job. But Santa's helper, he needs a lot of helpers.
Well,
anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just mention that you're like very prolific. Not only have you done all the books, you have a website just under your name, right?
Yeah, Lou Agosta.
LouAgosta.com. And it's just full of articles. I mean, you're just most prolific writer on the topic. I know.
Thank you. I've succeeded in being self-expressed. I mean, part of the challenge, and I maybe myself. Well, doing the tough work of empathy, one has to be honest and straight with oneself. And the tough thing is like, well, do I really want to descend into the hell of my own self-confrontation and how I'm kidding myself and all of my limitations and not only strengths, but weaknesses, right? That's the tough work, to prepare for empathy, to clean up one's integrity outages. And so I imagine people are reading this stuff.
Well, I read it.
Well, so there you go. Pardon me, I may need a Kleenex here. But, that's good. Thank you for that. So I acknowledge your empathy for reading it. And I just want to say it may be a little bit, it's no good to tell other people untruths. One wants to be honest in every way. And it is yet the untruths that one tells oneself that can be the most damaging. And maybe one of my own is like, people really like and read my stuff. Well, feel free to disagree. Feel free to engage, right? Because and so to go right to it, it's kind of an invitation for me to be self-expressed. And so I'm going to pause for breath. But the article that triggered this conversation, Compassion Fatigue, a Radical Proposal for Overcoming It. And when we last talked, we said man, let's define our terms up front.
Yay.
Empathy, remember?
Yep.
Empathy, compassion, you know, people are going round and round. I want to say whatever they mean, I think the world needs more of both of them. And they're on a short list of things like dignity, respect, community that we may usefully expand.
Yeah, so the terms we have here, I had actually made a list. We have the term empathy, we have compassion fatigue. I put in empathic distress and empathic fatigue. So these are sort of terms that are floating around there, out there. And so we want to kind of explore, you know, what we mean by those terms, which is kind of a big topic in itself.
It really, I'm going to strive to be concise here, because we could spend the whole session defining any one of those terms and going round. So I propose to put a stake in the ground, so to speak. And it's not that we have to agree, but we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, how about you give your definition, short definition of empathy. I'll give my short definition, then compassion. We just go through back and forth each of those terms just to get started. So how?
Okay, I guess I get to start then. My definition of empathy has 4 aspects. Be open to the other person, understand who they are as a possibility, take a walk in their shoes, that's bottom up and top down, and respond to them. Be responsive to the other person in a way that acknowledges their humanity. That's empathic responsiveness.
Okay. So for me, empathy is a feeling into someone's experience. So it's actually empathy is in feeling. So that's sort of how I define it. So I am feeling into my own feelings, which is self-empathy. I'm feeling into you. I'm feeling into your attention, your awareness. I can see you concentrating. I can feel you listening. So I'm sensing into your experience. And then there's another form of empathy, which I call imaginative empathy, which is I can role play. I can take on the role of anyone or anything and imagine myself being that and then feel into my experience from that role. So I call that, imaginative empathy. So that's the sense, the basics.
What I get from that is one of the things empathy does imaginatively is build a bridge to the other. So empathy enables me to imagine something that's possible and not possible, and across the bridge come things like feelings. And I got to believe in both directions, but at least initially, if I'm listening, I'm the one being receptive. And then
there's a mutuality. It's sort of a relational or mutual empathy. A culture of empathy for me is where everyone is listening deeply and sensing everyone else, which is sort of the direction I'm going, is that we need a culture where empathy, mutual empathy is like a shared value. So
I got it. I mean, and the world needs more of that.
Okay, so we want to go on to compassion.
Compassion.
Okay.
Compassion. I've worked less on compassion. Compassion is responding to the other person who is oftentimes in need or distress or struggling with something. In compassion, I intervene in the other person's situation to make a difference with their struggle in such a way that I help them. Is to provide help.
Okay, so for me, all these terms, there's one problem is I see that with empathy, compassion, there's like multiple definitions, right? And compassion is the same way. I'm the same as you. I haven't really dug into compassion, but that it does seem to be one of the core tenets of compassion is that awareness of others' suffering. So that's like whereas empathy, we're feeling all feelings, the full spectrum, and compassion is focused on being aware of pain and suffering. And it's there's different directions it can go. One is I see it the same as empathy, sensing into the pain and being very present to it. So it's almost the same as empathy. But there's another definition of compassion, is feeling sorry for a person. So I see, Lou, you're in pain. Like I start feeling sorry for you, but that's sort of a sympathetic response. It's not me just staying present with you in your pain and sort of feeling into it and kind of giving you space to go into it. It's me sort of reacting, saying, oh, I feel so sorry for you. So it's sort of a sympathetic. So there's sort of two different threads that are sort of diametrically opposed, because one is more of a presence with the other, and the other is sort of I feel sort of a sympathetic distress about you.
Well, yeah. I agree. I express agreement, and this is where we may do a whole session. I mean, I wonder, because I hear compassion as being a clearing for altruism and for intervention of a kind of good works, where I have some advantages in the moment that the other person may not have. And I intervene in such a way to make a difference for them, to their benefit. I mean, I'm just going to go with it here. I mean, one of the fundamental documents, I mean, I don't think one needs to be Christian in any narrow sense to engage with the story of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan being one of the local inhabitants of the area we now call the State of Israel, and it includes Palestine and the Holy Land and all of those territories there, Judea, and I'm not even sure of the list. But the one guy is going up to Jerusalem, and he gets beaten over the head and robbed and left more or less for dead. He's not dead. And the priest comes by and crosses the road and passes by. And the Levite, who I gather is a high caste or a high religious figure in the Hebrew faith, I believe, and he decides to cross the road and pass by. And the Samaritan, who's in effect a local yokel, comes by. And just to be descriptive, if we had the webcam, we can talk. I haven't said anything about what they experienced yet, right? And he stops and helps. And he gives him first aid, and then he takes him down the road to the local inn and gives the guy some money and says, take care of this guy. I'll be back in whenever it is, in a week or something, and I'll pay you the difference. So this man, the Samaritan, had some resources. At least he had a donkey and a few coins and some wine and bread, and the other guys in the ditch have dead. So what happened there? So I argue the first guy who crossed the road experienced empathic distress. It wasn't that he was hard-hearted. I mean, we could debate the point, but I can't handle this, man. This is too much. There's too much blood. It's too ugly. I got to get to church or temple and give my speech, and I'm on deadline. I got to go. The other guy comes by. He experiences what amounts to empathic distress. And this Samaritan comes by, and he gets that the other guy is suffering, and his empathy tells him that the survivor of the robbery is suffering. He's beaten up. His empathy tells him that the survivor is suffering, and his compassion tells him what to do about it. He intervenes. And he gives him first aid, and he takes. Now that's my interpretation.
Yeah, it's good to have a little narrative to put it into context. I think that's really helpful. Yeah.
And so I mean, I think this is potential. I mean, just to be an honest, to be an honest, straightforward broker. I think the matter is controversial, because there are readings of the story where the Levite and the priest, they're kind of hard-hearted. They don't really have the true. I mean, this is the Gospels, what one might call. Let me say something about spirituality. There are many ways it can be expressed: Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, I mean, I'm missing a few, but you get that's the kind of the short list that covers a lot of ground. And here, I'm interested in the spiritual dimension of this story, and that the one guy, there's a communication of feeling. The guy's suffering, and the first two guys see the suffering and say, "Man, they do." I called it empathic distress. It is a kind of compassion fatigue, or to use the word burnout, all three of these things: compassion fatigue, burnout, empathic distress. There's several nuanced differences between them. To be burned out, one has to have done it for a while, like working in the emergency room, working as a social worker in the inner city, where all of the cases are difficult, and it's very hard to make a difference in any one of them. And those, and teachers who the same difficult students year in, year out can get burned out. That's different than the immediate empathic distress that I think is captured nicely in the story of the Good Samaritan, where bam.
Well, let's hold on to that story and go to the different, because I have some differences in terms of just the vocabulary there, because you mentioned empathic distress. So let's go into what we're calling empathic distress.
Yeah.
Do you want to give your
that's what I can't. I'll give it. The short answer is I can't handle it, and I cross the road. I create distance between myself and the homeless person, or in this case, that narrative of the Good Samaritan, the survivor of the robbery. I can't handle it, and I cross the road, and I in effect dial down my empathy by taking some distance. And it's not. I'm not saying that's anything to be. I'm not saying I did that or didn't do it, but I'm using this as an example and as a paradigm. I mean, have I ever crossed the road to avoid, the third homeless person in a row as I walk downtown? I'm going to cop to it. I have to cop to it. It's like I couldn't. I'm not. No good excuse. But this is a world in which suffering and distress and need and scarcity and issues of that kind are abundant. So
there's the phenomenon that you're describing, and that's what's often called empathic distress. And what I see here is I just wrote, when you empathize, you feel into the pain, suffering, distress of others, and that you can feel distress or drained yourself.
Yeah.
And I did want to kind of reference, the definitions. One of the best sort of definitions of the different of empathy in related terms has been by Dan Batson, who did a lot of study, and he wrote an article or a paper about the different definitions. And he said he laid out 8 different definitions of how the word is used, which is just leading to all this confusion in academia. So he said concept 7, feeling distress at witnessing another person's suffering. A state of distress evoked by witnessing another's distress. You feel your feelings of anxiety and unease invoked by seeing how upset your friend was, having a variety of, and he lays out that because these terms don't just come out of nowhere. There's some academic or somebody that kind of is thinking about it and coined these terms. So he said this phenomenon that we're talking about in Krebs in 1975 just called it empathy. Then he says Hoffman in 1981 called it empathic distress, and Batson calls it just in 1991. He says he just calls it personal distress.
And in 2019, and actually considerably before this, a number of people have called it emotional contagion. So Hatfield and Cassiopeia. My apologies here on the tape for screwing up these names, but Cassiopeia. Oh, I'm just digging myself in a hole here, so I'll stop. But the book is entitled Emotional Contagion. So there's a communication of negative suffering, pain, bad feeling, negativity here, which overwhelms the individual. And I would distinguish that. See, so, here's the problem, and here's a potential solution that the thing that enabled the Samaritan to make a difference is he saw the suffering and he experienced the suffering of the survivor of the robbery, but as a vicarious experience, as a trace affect, as if, not to in any way diminish it, but he kind of got a sample of the survivor's suffering. He got a data sample or a trace of it without being overwhelmed, as if he were kind of the movie of the assault. I mean, in no way to diminish the difficulty or injustice or unfairness of the matter, but it was like as if he was in the movie, but he didn't, or in the theater, but he didn't actually, until he decided to, he just got a sample. And
well,
so he
that's
was
how.
able.
Sorry.
No,
So well, let me. Yeah, if you want to just. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Go ahead. Just finish.
I won't
that.
forget. I mean, it's okay. I won't forget. The thought is more or less complete. We can do a number on what is this thing, a vicarious experience, because in the literature, it's not much discussed. Batson, who does a great job, and all of those distinctions, where does he get them? Some of them are somewhat academic, but he's trying to capture the phenomenology of empathy. He's trying to capture. I mean, and does he succeed? Well, I think he does, but it's incomplete, and the debate, the debate is joined, right?
Yeah. Well, for me, with my definition of empathy, of feeling into the Good Samaritan in that sense is feeling into the experience of the other person. So they're sensing the feelings. They're not like, and then for me, if the Good Samaritan becomes totally distressed, like, oh, I'm all in this distress, that's actually for me a block to empathy, because he no longer has the capacity to feel into the subtle. You're feeling the suffering, the pain, but there's a lot of feelings associated and behind that, and specific needs, like, where is the pain? The pain is in my arm. It's like this. So you have to feel into the nuances of what the person is feeling and really understand what their needs are if you're wanting to kind of contribute to their well-being. And if you become distressed, then it blocks your awareness of empathy. And in that case, you're sort of needing empathy yourself to regulate, to deal with your own stress. So I actually see this thing. I think empathic distress is a horrible name for it. I just use the word personal distress, like Batson, because it's actually a block to empathy.
Agree. If I get distressed, it's a breakdown of empathy.
Yeah.
The empathy goes off the rails at that point. Perhaps there's an empathic intention. One's intentions are good, but it doesn't work. It misfires. I mean, now anything can misfire. I mean, it's no knock on empathy that my empathy is inadequate in a given moment or a given situation. I mean, if the trauma gets bad enough, almost anybody can be overwhelmed. It takes a very cool head to keep one's wits and to make a difference. Nevertheless, the powerful thing is to realize where empathy can go off the rails, and then, in effect, create a breakthrough in empathy out of the breakdown. If I stop with the communication of feeling, and I'm not aware where's the anxiety coming from, where's the vicarious experience of pain, it's kind of as if I have an after image of the other person's pain. You know how you can look at that flag, which is green. It's not red, white, and blue, but you look at the green, the yellow, and the whatever the third color is, and then you close your eyes and you see the red, white, and blue after image. Well, it's a little bit like having an after image of another person's experience. If it's a negative experience, of course, it's a negative after image. If it's a positive, if it's a joyous experience or happy, high spirits, then that's, the content of it. And then cycling through the different aspects of empathy. If we're talking about also the possibility of role playing, of taking a walk in the other's shoes, to use the folk definition aspect of empathy. And that can break down as projection, right? I mean, I would take a walk in their shoes, but I use my own, in effect, my own shoe size. Well, that tells me where my shoe pinches.
Right.
What I may usefully know is where your shoe pinches, because it might be the same place. It might, but it likely is different or nuanced in a different way. So, and then, you know, and then in the aspect of who is the other person as a possibility, there's all kinds of ways empathy can go off the rails. I mean, that empathy is powerful and makes a powerful difference. Doesn't mean we don't have to practice it. We do have to practice it. It's just like hopping on a bike for the first time. You wouldn't expect to join the Tour de France, you know, with my training wheels on, right? I mean, I'm not, in any case, joining the Tour de France, but it takes practice to get better at any skill, any activity. This is the skill. I mean, I think there is a skill aspect.
Yeah, it takes practice and skill to be empathic and to deepen your empathy and to maintain your empathy in different stressful situations. So instead of going, with practice, instead of going into distress, you can learn to stay present and stay grounded with the other person.
You use the experience as a resource, and you say, okay, this is what the other person is experiencing here, but I'm not experiencing it in the same way. I'm getting a sample, a trace, and what would be appropriate at this point in terms of, right, I mean, you know, we want to perhaps move on from the difficult example of somebody having to survive a criminal assault, because there's people have all kinds of issues which don't involve them ending up in a ditch with, you know, bruises and bloody cuts on their person, right? I mean, people are struggling with finances, people are struggling with relationships. Relationships are a big issue. People are struggling with careers. People are struggling with what? Peace of mind, how to get my life to work the way I want it to work. I mean, that's a big issue. People are struggling with community, building whatever their projects are. And that's where empathy can make a powerful difference.
It's nice to have a story, though, like this to kind of be able to, I find it helpful.
Well, it's a wonderful, powerful narrative, and for showing the difference. I think, you know, we may usefully move on to where we started, which was compassion fatigue. Which is, I think, slightly different than empathic distress. I'm going to just wing it here just a little bit, if I may, that the fatigue suggests that there have been a number of examples. I mean, I'm thinking of the example of the therapist or the social worker or the school teacher or the nurse or practical nurse or the healthcare professional or I'm not, you know, the professional of any kind. The defense attorney who's in effect working pro bono or working for minimum fees in criminal court. There's a fancy name for that kind of the court assigned attorney, right? Where he meets the client 2 hours before the trial and so seeing difficult, confronting instances of people's struggle, of their breakdowns, of their emotional, of their financial issues, results in compassion fatigue. People are called to helping professions because they want to make a difference. And then it's like one confronting issue after another, and they come away saying, hey, I need a job in an office where I can update the spreadsheet. I'm done with this. You know, people are it's just too much. Sometimes they say that.
Well, yeah. So let's see. I had some thoughts. I kind of lost it.
Well, if you want, I can continue while you're thinking and recovering.
Well, it was. Yeah, I guess there's a couple more terms. There was also the empathic fatigue, I guess, is what I want to go to. So some people are saying that what you're describing is empathic fatigue, right? So these are the terms that we had. We had the terms empathy, compassion, compassion fatigue, empathic distress, and empathic fatigue. So these are
Don't
just sort
forget
of
burnout. Let's say
empathic
burnout.
burnout.
I mean, isn't that kind of a catch-all?
The burnout is just a general catch-all term.
That's where I
there.
am after I've cycled through all of the above. I'm just emotionally.
Okay, I know now what it was. So another term that I wanted to bring in was a culture of empathy, because that's sort of the kind of the core value that I'm placing. What I mean by that is that you have the person on the side of the road, you know, who's been beaten up, robbed, and then you've got the Good Samaritan. We can see that story from the Samaritan was, you know, compassionate or empathic and kind of helped out the person that needed the victim, or whatever you want to call it.
I call him a survivor.
Survivor, yeah, maybe a better term. So that's sort of looking at it from an individualistic. It's like it's the individual of the Good Samaritan. But if we can also take the perspective of it's a relationship.
Yeah.
Right. That there's two people in this relationship, and what is the level of empathy between the two of them?
Yeah.
The person that's been robbed, it doesn't have a lot of capacity to empathize with the Good Samaritan. Right. It's like they're in distress. They just like trying to survive. So the Samaritan comes over, empathizes, is aware of the survivor. And is empathizing and then seeing what they need for their well-being.
Yeah.
And if the Samaritan goes into distress about it, in a sense, they need empathy. Then they're both low in empathy, right? So what we're trying to do is get a situation where they're both sort of empathizing with each other.
Yeah.
There's a mutual deepening of the empathy between each other. And when you find solutions with empathy, it's sort of a co-design of solutions, right? It's like, oh, I hear your arm is hurting, you know, and you can't, you know, this part of your body is hurting. And what would be beneficial for solving those problems? You know, you're going to need some rest. You're going to need a bit of money. You're going to need this. The thing with the compassion, if it's a sympathetic compassion, it's like, oh, I'm feeling distressed. I'm just going to try to get rid of my compassion, you know, stress, and solve the problem so it solves my problem, not necessarily your problem. And you hear a lot about that with, you know, do good kind of, you know, going to the developing world. We're going to create a dam. It's going to give you all electricity, but, you know, have all these horrendous effects. So it's not it's not a mutually co-designed solution to the problem. So that's a little bit of a problem with the sympathetic solving, because you're just solving for yourself, but you're not solving for the mutual relationship part. So that's sort of the relational mutual empathy. And it's the same thing for all those people that you were talking about, you know, the physicians, all those people in different, it's a relationship. And the problem is they're not getting the empathy from the larger culture, from their staff, from their administration to support them in feeling heard, seen, and acknowledged. So it's,
no, on the contrary, they're getting numbers. I mean, you got to get your numbers and see more patients a day, or more clients a day, or billable hours. You know.
Yeah,
what
15 minutes per patient. Yeah.
Well, what I'm getting is that even in this narrative of the Good Samaritan, what is missing is a culture of empathy. If you don't actually say it right flat out, but what happens as a thought experiment, as in our empathic imagination, if we were to try and envision and imagine a culture of empathy coming to the story of the Good Samaritan, we would want to include, I mean, this is a fairly radical idea, we would want to include the thieves, the perpetrators.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not flat out, I mean, I'm not sure there's a kind of a delicate matter of bringing empathy to the perpetration. Well, no, not it. One has to have strict boundaries. A crime is a crime, and assault is assault. And this is a culture of scarcity in which, for one reason or another, the individuals are led to perpetrate crimes, stealing the man's money. I'm thinking because they don't have any. I mean, this is not piracy on the high seas where the pirates are already rich. Actually, we now know the pirates are pretty poor. But if there were a culture where people wouldn't have to rob and steal in order to satisfy their basic needs for food and shelter and a modest amount of entertainment, then it'd be an entirely different conversation. Then the Samaritan and the guy going up to Jerusalem to do his business up there could meet together at the inn and have some refreshment and break some bread and, I don't know, transact a business deal or share stories about their families or share stories about their aspirations to be liberated from Roman rule or what, the Romans were running the show apparently in the whatever it was, 24 after the Christian era or something. So what that looks like is very radical.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm totally with you. And Martin Luther King kind of addressed this too. He said, compassion or something was more than just flinging a coin to a beggar. It's like, what is the system that created that? So in my story, the Good Samaritan helps out the person was a Sumerian or no, it was a...
Samaritans, I've read up on National Geographic and, the Samaritans were local inhabitants of the region. We're thinking they were not Christian because Christianity hadn't really been invented yet.
But what race was or ethnic group was the...
I can't go there right now other than to say they were local inhabitants. Actually, by that time, the Hebrew people were local inhabitants and the Palestinians were local inhabitants. And the Romans weren't local inhabitants, but they were kind of becoming local inhabitants. And it was really a melting pot that didn't melt and is still unmelted.
So the story would continue if we're building a culture of empathy, that the Samaritan would, help out, empathize with the needs of the person who was beat up. And then they would get together and they say, we have a real problem here, that we have an empathy deficit. We have a deficit of empathy in society. Let's work together and go reach out to those robbers and have an empathy circle with them. Yeah. It's like we go there and then they would reach out and they'd say, we want an empathy circle with you to hear what your concerns are and for us for you to hear what our concerns are, and that we really need a more empathic society to work together. Yeah. So they would reach out and they would create this have the intention of creating a culture of empathy, and that they would sort of transform society and, even transform the Romans. Say, well, we need an empathy circle with the Romans. We're here to listen to you. We're not trying to overthrow the government here. We just want to have an empathic dialogue and create a more empathic society. So that for me would have been sort of this constructive forward motion instead of this individualistic, just be a nice person individually and help people out. It's like, hey, let's look at the whole cultural system that we live in. And this whole system has a lot of empathy deficits within it. And how do we work together and I think that fits with the compassion fatigue or, in the medical field too, and all these other fields that you're talking about, is we really need a larger vision of transforming society to raise the level of empathy within the whole society and the whole system.
I think it's a little bit like you made allusion to Martin Luther King, who's always an inspiration. It's the dilemma that I think you and I are in. Timestamp this thing right now on December 17th, 2019. I don't know, 11:45 Pacific time, 1:45 Central Standard Time or something. I'm losing track of the time here. Here's the dilemma. I mean, it's a little bit like Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks gets on the bus and she doesn't move to the back of the bus, right? in order for Rosa Parks in Birmingham, Alabama in approximately 1953 or thereabouts, in order for her to ride in the front of the bus, she has to transform the entire community.
Mm-hmm.
She can't just, in order for this individual, I mean, now the good news here is she had some powerful friends in the vicinity of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and that would be Martin Luther King. I mean, and it still was a 10-year struggle. This thing didn't, between her intervention and approximately 10 years later, the Voting Rights Act is enacted under the, Lyndon Baines Johnson, get a supermajority in Congress, beaten Barry Goldwater pretty badly there, and enables him to get the legislation through. And if you can get, now that didn't create, immediate justice anywhere, but it did create the possibility of people electing a sheriff of their own choosing. In counties which had a majority African American or people of color, they could then elect a sheriff who didn't look the other way when terrible, appalling injustices occurred, right? So that we're kind of in that, because it seems completely unrealistic what you are proposing. To put, I mean, you can't, I mean, here, it takes to put the perpetrators and the Samaritan and the survivor, who I believe actually the survivor was a Jewish person going up to Jerusalem, because Jesus, who was a Jewish person, was telling the story to kind of who is my neighbor. The scribes and the Pharisees were challenging him, trying to get him in trouble with the Romans, which eventually they did. And it didn't go very well at that point, but nevertheless, it doesn't look like, I mean, you're saying, be open to the possibility. And I line up with that. I mean, there's no excuse for assault and robbery. We're not consciencing that. We're saying that the matter is problematic because of social injustice at a number of levels. But two wrongs don't ever make a right. Clear. Two wrongs don't make a right, just because you could ask for help, but you can't steal or rob and do things like that. So I want to be clear. I want to put that on the tape. And so I like, once somebody, here's the challenge I see. These human beings are an aggressive species. It contains an example, this narrative, the parable begins with an appalling example of human aggression, which then goes on in another direction. But when you look at that, there's an empathy. I mean, it's not only an empathy breakdown, it's a breakdown of I don't know, simple decency and dignity and respect for boundaries, right? And once the boundaries are blown up, it's really problematic what one has to do to restore them. And you see that. I mean, two wrongs don't make a right. I'm sticking to my story. Just because others, and that was the power of Gandhi and King. It's radical to appeal to the conscience of the racist sheriff. You see, but you could actually get away with that in the United States of America, as bad as the situation really was. It's a bad situation. But you could, I mean, it did actually kind of work, albeit in a strange way.
Yeah, the system of the bus was that the system and the people in it, the whites, were not being empathic with the black bus riders, right? They're not being sensitive to their experience.
No,
and so they stood up and confronted it, and it did transform the system. So
yeah, well, that's right. I mean, I would actually split a few hairs. They not only were they not being empathic, they were not being fair. They were not being decent. They were not being courteous. I mean, empathy is a high bar. We don't get to empathy. What about basic courtesy? If, everybody, after an 8-hour shift, a woman, needs the seat on the front of the bus. Let her sit down, regardless of whatever, race, creed, national origin. So I think there's power in the idea of an empathy circle and including everyone in the empathy circle here. I think that's what, I mean, a person named Jesus tells his story. I mean, I'm down with Jesus as a psychologist. I want to actually kind of set aside the actual religious dimension, although I acknowledge the spiritual dimension here, since this is going to go, I mean, it's fine. But he's a powerful and I think an insightful psychologist at this moment. There's even the word empathy. I'm not even sure what it would be in Old Testament Greek. There is a word, But I don't think it occurs in the Gospels. Instead, we have this story, which often gets called a story about compassion. Be altruistic, be charitable. And it is about that. I mean, it is about charity and altruism. And that's Batson's thing. You mentioned C. Dan
Mm-hmm.
Batson earlier on. And he says, it looks like empathy is pro-social. It creates a clearing. Empathy creates a clearing. And what happens is people into that clearing comes helping behavior.
Connection. I think first it comes
Altruistic
connection
behavior.
and understanding. So
Yeah.
it's like you hear like, oh, I really get where you're coming from. And hey, I
Yeah.
would kind of do the same thing if I was in that situation. I kind of get it. And
Yeah,
I
you
feel
would.
that,
You would do the same thing. And I would do the same thing. And most of the people but there are others who wouldn't. And that's the problem. The perpetrators who began the story wouldn't do that into the clearing of empathy.
but if you hear their story, it could be, hey, we're like starving here.
Yeah, we're starving,
it's like
man.
the Jews have been suppressing us, because they're in power. They're taking all of our, money and whatever. So there could have been another story behind why they're doing what they're doing.
There's a story behind the story. I mean, careful with what you just said. I mean, I think, you're fantasizing and imagining somebody's oppressing somebody, and it's quite possible that the perpetrators had a grievance. There are a lot of aggrieved people, and two wrongs don't make a right. I mean, they could have...
Two wrongs don't make a right, but an empathy circle makes understanding and connection is what I'm trying to say. So the thing, so I think that Good Samaritan story misses the context, and how to address. It's a good first step, but it's like taking it to what we were talking about, that they get together and they start creating empathy circles, local empathy circles, and they bring the Jews and the Sumerians together, and they start understanding each other, and they start kind of co-designing solutions to their culture and work through the whole society and transform society.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the solution. I mean, drive out cynicism, drive out aggression, drive out this is blue sky and not possible, drive out resignation to the status quo, drive out the aggression of the perpetrators, drive out the social injustice of the Romans, drive out the back and forth between the local inhabitants. And
I wonder if
and empathy shows up. Yeah. Bottom line, empathy naturally shows up.
I wonder, I would look at it's like the thing that transforms those things that you're talking about is to empathize with them. As I hear, like here in Berkeley, the right wing come, and Berkeley, everybody gets all upset, says, oh, they're being hateful, and we're against hate. But instead of that, it's like I go out there with the empathy tent and I say, let me come and listen to you. Let me hear what's going on for you. And so I think it's more than driving it out. It's hearing those feelings. We hear the feelings that you're mentioning. We're hearing what's behind the so-called hate, or behind the aggression, behind the cynicism. And it's the empathizing with that. We feel into it, and the feeling into it sort of transforms it.
Yeah.
So
what I'm getting is that empathy soothes anger, aggression, rage, and it
soothes and transforms.
It's good at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's good at that. And one, it's a balm on the angry wound, and that can open up a lot of possibilities that
creative
weren't visible
possibilities,
that weren't visible previously,
yeah,
or that one would not have thought of. It would even be imaginable that these people would get together.
Yeah. So let's say with that story, which you had started with, is that the
didn't
story,
make it up.
Yeah, you didn't make it up, but you brought it here.
Yeah.
That they get together, the Jew is healed, and they develop a friendship.
Well, he gets first aid. Yeah.
He gets first aid, and then they start having empathy circles. They bring their two families together and they have empathy circles, and they say, we really need a more empathic society. And they start reaching out to other people, and they start, sort of building this more empathic society. So that's sort of the narrative that would be sort of building this culture of empathy, you know, together is sort of the direction that I think this story, you know, could go in, and it sort of translates to a lot of other situations too.
Agree. And which is why the story is so powerful and empathy is so powerful. That empathy, you know, I mean, to bring it back to where we started with the matter of compassion fatigue and a radical proposal. I mean, talk about a radical proposal. That's a culture of empathy and empathy circles. That's a radical proposal in the face of no possibility or what seemed like problematic possibilities. An empathy circle can reduce conflict and open up possibility of mutuality, reciprocity, of win-win.
Mm-hmm.
Because
creative. It's like
at the beginning of
mm-hmm.
the story, there kind of are no winners. I mean, it's true the perpetrators have absconded with the survivor's money and whatever of value he had. I guess, you know, but it's like it's not going to go well. The Romans are going to catch up with them, and that's not, you know, you don't want to run afoul of it. But what I do want to say, just by way of bringing it back to where we started, I think that'd be a useful thing to do. The proposal, if one is suffering from compassion fatigue, is to dial down the compassion and dial up the empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That it is the reason I call that a radical proposal is because if one is suffering compassion fatigue, it is a radical thought. Maybe one is being too compassionate. Instead of taking a sample of the other person's experience, one is merging with the other person's experience and then being overwhelmed by the trauma, being in effect vicariously re-traumatized or traumatized, full stop, by the experience. So dial down the compassion and dial up the empathy. That is the top-down empathy. Take a walk in the other person's shoes, whether they're dealing with, understand who they are as a possibility, that they're not just broken and assaulted, but that, you know, they need some first aid and some rest and recreation. It's not funny, right? But you know, to imaginatively replay the scenario and then to respond in a human way. So I mean, this is now Lou Agosta, not necessarily either, you know, the evangelists and Jesus' a psychologist or whoever else is commenting, but empathy tells me what the other person is experiencing. My good morals, my ethics, my upbringing, my commitment to community tell me what to do about it. And that's, you know, that's the sense of where I may split hairs a little bit with C. Daniel Batson, for whom empathy is inherently pro-social. When you know, I mean, I see it as a somewhat more nuanced thing, that these human beings are difficult. And, you know, once somebody hits you on the head, you don't actually need empathy. You need something like jujitsu or tai chi, and to restore boundaries. And then we can talk about empathy again once the boundaries have been restored. Nevertheless, empathy is a powerful force. And the idea of bringing a culture of empathy and empathy circles where, you know, you just listen and really give back to the other person what I have heard in the same way that they recognize what it is that he or she has said. It's not just I listen and wait for my turn. I have to give back to you what you said to me, gave to me in such a way that you acknowledge, okay, Lou, you got it. Or you got, you know, I don't know, 60% of it or 40%.
I feel satisfied that you understand, you know, where I am.
Yeah. And then we iterate, of course, if I didn't get it perfect, which is quite possible, quite imaginable that one would not get it. So I mean, I think, you know, what you're saying is so right on. And the empathy tent, I mean, it's literally a physical structure. Yes, you set up a tent.
We have,
you know,
I have two of them. We set them up in different areas. We have one in LA, so two.
And I do want to get, I mean, I have that other shirt which calls out a rigorous and critical empathy. Maybe we have to do a conversation about what the heck that is going forward. Because I think it sometimes happens, a person thinks they have empathy, and they may usefully consider bringing a rigorous and critical consideration to their own empathy and being rigorous and critical about it. And that may take it up a level. But so I'm going to actually reel it back in and say, once again, the idea of an empathy circle is a powerful one and making a difference.
I think
so
that
many ways.
addresses what we call compassion fatigue. Like if you're feeling overwhelmed, you need the empathy from others, the people around you. That's actually the healing. It's like, hey, I'm feeling really stressed. I'm feeling really burned out. And you just share that with others. And then it creates a space like, oh, you start feeling connected to others. You start feeling understood to others. And so that's like a healing process for the compassion fatigue.
So.
And then you start finding solutions like, oh, I create space, like, maybe I need to take more walks in nature. So you kind of tap into the energy to find other solutions for that stress and fatigue. So I do want to keep us on time. I can go on forever, but I don't know how your schedule is.
As can we both, I think. I agree. I think that's a wonderful thought on which to end. I mean, and acknowledging also that the conversation, I think we may usefully do additional conversations.
Yeah, I'm all for that. I really enjoy talking with you, and because you've looked at this topic and are working on it, pretty intensely, and really.
I want to get that T-shirt. I mean, I do need. I've got a couple of T-shirts, but that one is new, and I think
send me your address.
Okay, I got the email. We'll work it out.
Yeah, just give me the. I'll mail it to you.
I acknowledge your empathy, and thank you, and and I look forward very much to further conversations.
Me too.